Hi everybody. So thank you so much for checking out this video and welcome back. So now we're into the next episode of this Creating Your Protagonist series. This is lesson 3, and if you're following along, you basically at this point will have created a basic synopsis for your story. You'll have a general theme and synopsis, and also just from the first lesson, an understanding of what the surface level and subconscious motivations of your characters are, at least the general idea of what that is. This week is when we start coming up with those specific motivations. So here we're going to be going through and coming up with a backstory for your character, and we're going to be going over the motivations as well. So backstory and motivations. This is the main thing. This is kind of what the lessons of the past 2 weeks have led up to, is this. And so I'm going to repeat this. I've said this before in the videos, but each part I put on here, as well as last week's, you're going to want to review several times, especially when we get to the motivations. I'm going to hammer this home. I'm going to say it again at some point during this video, because what you're going to do is when you come up with this the first time, a lot of your motivations are going to be surface level. I'm not saying surface level in terms of like an actual surface motivation. I'm saying surface level in that you haven't dug deep enough. You haven't found a unique motivation for your character. You haven't found the real motivation, the real thing that's pushing them. You probably will not find it out by doing this lesson once or even twice. It takes repetition to really get to know your character. And so I approach this process from not knowing who your character is and discovering who they are through this process. So it's going to feel very organic. When you do this, the characters tend to become a bit more of their own people. They tend to feel a bit more real. You don't necessarily know who they are going into this process. At least for me, that's what I tend to find. So when I go through it, it's almost like I'm interviewing. It's almost like they're a real person that I'm interviewing to potentially audition for my story, if you want to think of it that way. And that tends to be how I tend to view it. You may not view it that way, but if you do, you're on the right track. If it feels that way to you and it feels like they're their own kind of person and you're just sort of telling the tale, but they're their own individual entity, they could exist without you. If it feels that way, you're on the right track. You've done these lessons correctly. It won't feel like that for everybody, but if you do feel that way, that's a good sign. So let's get into it. So first thing is backstory. What we're going to do is come up with a backstory for our character. It's going to be a very, very simple backstory. At least my example is going to be, because I don't want to show too much information because it's still a work in progress, this book. And I just don't want to give kind of the core things of the book away before it's actually published. So going to keep it a bit vague here. But what we're going to do is we're going to take the synopsis we generated in part 4. So from last week's lesson, part 4, and come up with the backstory for the protagonist. My example from last week was, the example synopsis was, what if 2 local wrestlers were given a chance to compete for a contract, facing a chance to compete at a world-class level? Both competitors scheme against one another for a chance to be scouted. I think I used compete 3 times in that. So again, this is not something anyone's ever going to see. It doesn't need to be even grammatically correct. It doesn't need to be a polished sort of thing. This is for you. This is something that only you are ever going to see. And so that's it right there in 3 sentences, the general synopsis of what the story is going to be about. Now, this backstory that we're going to come up with can be very elaborate. So go into detail. Fill up page after page after page if you have to. Most of your backstory will not even make it into the main book. That's okay. You need to know it. It goes back to kind of the Hemingway idea that all characters operate on the page from a backstory that's real to them, but that you, the reader, are not aware of. And so this backstory is going to be very real for your characters, and they're going to operate from this, even if we never see it on the page. And so I'm going to show you my examples right here. It's only 3 short things. Yours can be page and page and page. I've talked before in one of my lessons from last month when I talked about the process basically of getting my first novel there done, where the novel developed from a backstory exercise that I was doing for another novel. I basically wrote out like 10 pages of a backstory And it turned out to be much more interesting than my original story I was writing, and I made that backstory the actual novel. That's kind of what I'm advocating here. Come up with pages if you have to. Fill up several pages of this. Don't just do a couple little lines like I did. This is again, it's just to brevity, not to just to avoid going into too much detail on my story. That is still technically a work in progress. Okay, so my example for my protagonist I came up with was they moved to a small town to be a wrestler. The wrestling school was in the small town, so they moved there. They're not originally from the town. They lost a relationship over their desire to be a wrestler, and now they live alone. Last thing is they work a menial job to get by. That's it as far as what I'm going to show. That's the basic backstory. Now, the person taking the lesson here, I want you to do something like this initially. That this is fine. So three sentences, three individual things, bullet pointed, fine. But now go back to it and go deeper. Start going into more of their motivations. And again, it doesn't have to be, you can do it in pages like I've done it before, but you can just start expanding this bullet point. Move to a small town. Where were they from originally? What was their life like before that? They lost a relationship, right? So what was the relationship like in the beginning? Was the person supportive of their decision to be a wrestler in the beginning? Was, just as an example for my thing. Were they always against it? It just was something they overlooked at the early stages, and now as time went on, it became more of an issue. Go deeper. Every single one of these points I listed on here could be much deeper. I could go in much more detail, and you yourself need to do that. So constantly go back, just constantly make revisions to this thing, and just always go deeper with this. At the end, after several revisions, you should have a pretty solid backstory for your protagonist on what you want. All right. Part 6 now. So once you've come up with the backstory, now is time for the motivation. This is where the main area of focus for these lessons is going to be on. Ironically, this is the last part of the lesson for today's video, but everything you've done up to this point has served as a focus of coming up with a character motivation. So, as a quick reminder, if you saw the first lesson, you know what surface and subconscious motivations are. But for those that skipped ahead, didn't watch it, whatever, surface is what a character wants, what their plot motivation is. Subconscious now is what the character actually wants, their deeper desire, their reason for why they are doing this, or the reason for why they are doing anything in the story. Oftentimes, it's not necessarily known to the character either. They may not be aware of this. Often, the motivations that they really have that just don't really occur to them. They're not really aware of it. Hence why they're called subconscious. And this is the part where we're going to develop these motivations for a protagonist. So what you're going to do is you're going to take part 3. So from last week's lesson, the previous lesson, and then part 5, what we just did for the backstory, and try to come up with the surface and subconscious motivation for your character. For those that are trying to remember, part 3. This was simply the theme or idea of the story, the thing you're trying to come up with, or what you want your story to explore, an area of exploration, the main exploration, which was a dream is not worth it if you lose yourself in the pursuit of it. Okay, that was mine, as well as the backstory. So you take that plus the backstory, and we start working on coming up with the motivations. I'm gonna say again, revisit this multiple times to deepen your character's motivation. You will not, on the first pass, come up with all of the motivations, or their true deep motivation. Okay, so I'll give you an example. So for that same protagonist, what's their service goal? Being scouted. That is the main synopsis of the story, right? Like I said before, they're competing. 2 guys are competing for a contract to become nationally scouted. Character's goal, to be scouted. All right. But now, let's get into the subconscious now. Let's get into the real motivation. What does your character really want? And this is what's going to take a lot of time. The surface stuff will not, you probably know that right just from the plot, right? Just from the plot, you'll probably know what they want. What do they really want? Well, it took me, myself, just going into this process for myself, several passes. It took me, I mentioned before, I think it took me about a week to come up with this, to really get to the, kind of the core of this character's motivation. And I'm not even going to show you the full thing because it gets too much into the plot of the story. I'm going to show you just the first few layers of it. So, what do they want? Well, validation. After exploring the story, after looking at the synopsis, coming up with reasons why they would want to be scouted, I came up with the fact that the character wants to be scouted because they want to be validated. And so I went through again. I said, all right, they want to be validated, but what does that mean to them? What does being validated mean to them? Well, they're trying to prove themselves to another person, which I think is kind of the definition of validation. But now we're going deeper. All right, so they want to prove themselves to someone else. They're not seeking validation just to, just to sort of, not self-validation, not seeking it just because they're trying to prove to themselves. They're trying to prove they can get scouted to someone else. Now, I mentioned the character in the last lesson here. I mentioned that the character lost their ex over the fact, over wrestling, right? Over their career choice. So, going deeper with this, exploring deeper, discovered that they are trying to prove themselves to a former lover that they have the talent to be scouted, i.e. they're trying to show them up. They're trying to sort of prove to this ex that, hey, I could actually do this. I actually could make this a successful career, okay? Again, this didn't come right away. This took several things of just digging deeper, and you'll see each bullet point just goes deeper. So you can take like a single idea and just keep going deeper. That doesn't need to be, pages of written out. You can just, hey, validation, why? Well, prove themselves to another person. Why do they want to prove themselves to another person? Why? Well, they're trying to prove to an ex-lover that they're trying to show up. Again, we're just refining this each time. And so I'm not going to go any further with what that means because, again, it's going to get too much into the plot, too much into kind of the weeds of the story, and I don't want to reveal that much here, just because it's not done and because, again, it's not published yet or anything like that. But you will, for myself, I have several bullet points that go even further in terms of depth. I very, very much, basically, it goes much further than this. This is just the first 3 layers. This is just kind of the first 3 passes, really, of doing this. And discovering the subconscious desire that you have, it's going to require you to dig deeper as you uncover the motivations. And again, it comes with repetition. You have to do this multiple times. All right? That's the last time I'm going to say it. I've said it several times now, but I am repeating this because the success comes from repetition. If it's not deep, if it's not original, if it's not even original, but if it's not a solid reason, if it's not some really good motivation for your character, even if it's a cliched motivation, if it's not a true one to your character, you haven't gone deep enough yet. So continue to go deep. The way to break stereotypes and cliches is with depth. The more distinct you can make something feel, the less it feels like a cliche. Which is what writing really is. It's taking tropes and cliches and going very, very deep with how you describe them, with how you implement them, with how you show them to make them feel original again. Woo. So, quick recap here. Again, backstory motivations. This whole lesson was about, I'm going to break my rule now. I'm going to say it one more time, repetition. With these lessons, go through multiple times. Take a pen and paper, go through multiple times. But really, there's not a whole lot to this, is there? Like, with all this being said, what's this, like a 7-minute video, something like that? I think maybe 15 minutes, something. Not very long at all. Why is that? Well, it's not that complicated. It requires multiple layers of revision. It requires practice. It requires a lot of time spent trying to discover your character, a lot of boredom, a lot of the boring part of writing, really, for some people. But it's not that complicated. It's not that difficult. And so I want you to go through this lesson here, again, several times, do this, and then once you feel like you have a sufficient motivation and a sufficient backstory for your character, go on to the final lesson where we're going to work on next week, which is going to be on obstacles, and then for your character. And then once you have the motivations and their obstacles, well, we can start plotting. We have the two things that we need to plot, right? A motivation is a reason why they're going on the journey, and then the obstacles they're going to face along the journey, or some ideas that we can start throwing in there. So that's going to be it. But that'll be it for at least today's lesson. I will see you all next week. If you have any kind of questions though on any of this, let me know. Leave it in the comments and I can get back to you. Otherwise, I will see you all next week.